It's highlighted just how far some journalists are prepared to go to get that all-important exclusive.
But maybe we shouldn't be surprised. Andrew Neil explains that pulling a few tricks to be first with the new news is very old news indeed.
In the business of news, the best news a newspaper can bring is big news no one else has. But there's nothing new about that.
The exclusive, the good old-fashioned scoop, has been holding the front page for centuries.
Our earliest newspapers were made up in every sense in that great 18th century talking shop, the coffee house.
The facts weren't always allowed to get in the way of a good story, but that didn't stop the readers from lapping up every word.
You never know what you're going to find when you pick up a newspaper.
1726, about a woman giving birth to 17 rabbits at Godalming near Guildford in Surrey.
She didn't actually give birth to the rabbits, but she managed to convince the King's surgeon and many other eminent doctors that she had.
And she did it for money?
She did it for money.
Nothing changes.
Newspapers are about making money, and you make money by selling.
Crime always sells. Look at this, police news. Sketches of Jack the Ripper and the police. The seventh horrible murder of the monster of the East End.
William Madge, who was the managing director of the People, somebody dashed into his office and said there'd been a horrible murder in Whitechapel. He halted the presses, raced to the East End just in time to see the body laid out. Somebody else came along and said there'd been another murder. So he raced there and caught that murder as well, dashed back to his office, wrote the story up, rolled the presses again. Record sale of the People that day.
The electrical telegraph meant that you didn't always have to be on the spot to be first with the story. The Reuters Telegram Company was the first with news of the relief of Mafeking in 1900 during the Boer War.
This is the old Reuters building. 5 years ago, it was the last of the big news organizations to leave Fleet Street, once the home of our national newspapers.
Fleet Street was a hotbed of newspaper activity.
Whatever paper you worked for, there was just no escaping the competition on Fleet Street, where the fight to be first was always cutthroat.
You'd hire planes, you'd hire buses, you'd steal the opposition's car, you'd send them in the wrong direction, you'd put bent 2-penny coins, old-fashioned big ones, in the red phone box to stop the other side using the only phone box for miles. You'd buy up the victim's family, of course. You'd make sure that if they said, here's a photograph of our beloved son, you'd say, do you mind if you give me the negative, so we can make a nicer picture? That meant the other side couldn't get the negative when they came round the corner 10 minutes later. It was ruthless.
Fleet Street journalists were just as ruthless when it came to running up expenses in pursuit of their scoops. The Daily Mail's Vincent Mulcrone famously claimed for the purchase of a camel when on assignment in Africa. When asked to produce the beast, he claimed for his funeral. Scoops are often expensive and the risks are huge if you get it wrong. One of the Sunday Mirror's most famous headlines costed a packet in court. In its biggest 72-point Helvetica compressed typeface, the Mirror proclaimed unsavoury links between a gangster, Ronnie Kray, and Lord Robert Boothby. Boothby won libel damages of £40,000, more than £500,000 in today's money. But the story was true, and Boothby had also been carrying on an affair with Prime Minister Harold Macmillan's wife, Dorothy.
But it didn't matter. For a while, those libel damages seriously impaired the impulse to be first.
And fears about getting it wrong may well be turning today's tabloids back to the celebrity rumours and tittle-tattle newspapers started with 300 years ago.
Every journalist worth their salt wants to break the next Watergate or match-fixing scam. But these days, editors have to wonder, why go to all the investigative bother and legal hassle if all you have to do for a good scoop is get your checkbook out and pay for it?
Andrew's here. Andrew, you're so glad to see it. Glad to see it. So now that journalists can't hack phones, what are they going to do?
Well,
exactly?
let's make sure they aren't hacking phones. I'm not so sure. You know, I think it's been happening quite recently, and they shouldn't be hacking phones unless you really have a pressing public interest. And trying to find out what's on some film star's voicemail is not a pressing public interest. That's just a fishing expedition.
Probably boring.
And, well, apparently, I'm really worried because apparently they've been hacking my voicemail and they've never published anything. I mean, how sad is that? But Sigourney and I will put that right. And they got to get back to old-fashioned work. Proper investigative journalism means telling stories, important stories in the public interest that powerful people don't want to be told.
Have they got the time?
That's like Watergate, the Sunday Times and thalidomide.
Have they got the
These
time
are the
and
kind
money
of
to do
stories.
that anymore?
They still have the, well, they seem to pay a lot of money for celebrity stories and a lot of money for columnists who've got nothing to say. So if they want to spend the money, they've got the money. It's a question of spending it on the journalism that matters rather than the tittle-tattle in celebrity journalism.
I'm also interested because you were an editor of the Sunday Times at the time. Did you know it's a great, big, enormous newspaper? Did you know literally where every story had come from? Were you that concerned by what your reporters were doing?
Pretty much, yeah. I'll tell you why. Because the consequences of getting it wrong in this country are huge. I mean, we have the toughest libel laws in the world. You can go down for £1 million, £2 million, plus the court costs. So you had to know, and that's why. You know, every time you hear people saying, well, I didn't know this was going on in my newspaper, you have to ask why, because the lawyers would have been asking and the management that had to write the bills would have been asking.
The buck stopped there. Sigourney, what's the most ludicrous thing you've ever read about yourself?
Well, I was on the cover of some sort of, I think it was an English magazine, saying I was having a big affair with Roman Polanski because someone had taken a picture of me in a cafe with him in Rome talking about doing Death and the Maiden together. And he actually called to say, shall we sue this magazine? And I said, oh, Roman, this is the most interesting thing that anyone's ever said about me. Please don't. Let's not sue them. Let's encourage them.
It's almost to the point where if we read that you'd been abducted by aliens after all the films, we'd actually probably think that was possible.
Yes, and I'd like that, too.
Yeah.
I'm ready.
It's what the tabloids call a story too good to check.
Right. Let it run.
Exactly.
Just before we go, we've been